Chapter 36. The Hunter's Return. Reyes pulled back the string of his bow, taking careful aim. Then he released the arrow. It was an easy shot, even without the bracelets. His missile flew straight and true and struck its intended target right between the eyes, killing the young buck instantly. "Good shot," Cagline said in a begrudging voice. Cagline was the hunt leader, one of the 3 harpies that had landed in the top branches of one of the neighbouring trees. The other 2 were Lagnoff and a girl by the name of Wallog that Reyes hadn't even met before today. The 5th member of the hunt had taken a perch on a branch in the same tree as Reyes had. This was Gagara, and from the tone of her voice it was clear that at least she was impressed with Reyes' bow skill. "You make an excellent huntress, handsome." Cagline left her perch in the tree and flew down to the kill, followed quickly by the other 4. The 5 of them then formed a rough circle about the kill, with Reyes standing just to the left of Cagline and to the right of Gagara. He could feel his heart thumping in his chest, excitement powered by adrenaline at yet another successful kill. The hunt leader wasted no time. She squatted down by the deer corpse and carefully pried the arrow loose from the creature's skull. By the look of it, the arrow was still in fairly good condition and could be used again. Cagline handed the arrow back to Reyes. Reyes cleaned the tip of the arrow off on a large leaf of a nearby plant and then returned it to his quiver. He was down to just 3 arrows, and had been since he had accidentally snapped the head off of one during a hunt about a week ago. These days it always felt like a bonus when he got one of his arrows back. He knew that before too long he was going to have to pay a visit to Harpy Town and get some more, probably from the same place he'd gotten his replacement bow. He would need to get hold of some fancy stones for that, but fortunately there were shops in the markets that sold them by the 100. Cagline stood up from the kill and took a step back to make room. She turned her attention to the one called Wallag. "Okay, get to work." Wallag was the hunt's butcher. Every hunting party had a butcher. The butcher of the hunt rarely carried a bow, but what she did carry was a set of very sharp metal knives. It was her job to skin the kill and to remove any excess weight, such as the intestines and the antlers. Then, if the kill was too large to be carried by one huntress, as in the case of a deer, she would cut the meat into roughly equal chunks. No one ever really wanted to be the butcher. Usually the job was given to the huntress who had the least skill with a bow. Nevertheless, a good, experienced butcher could skin and prepare a carcass, such as the deer in front of them, in less than 5 minutes. As Wallag worked, Cagline closed the gap between herself and Reyes. "That was a good shot," she declared again. "Thank you," Reyes replied proudly. "But please, try to wait for the rest of us to be ready, and for me to give the order. For a start, that deer wasn't in the most optimum position. If you had waited just a few more seconds, that beast would have been in a better place for us all. Secondly, by firing alone, you run the risk of chasing the kill away, should you miss. If we all fire together, then we have 4 chances instead of 1 of hitting the beast." "Sorry," Reyes apologised, feeling suitably chastised. He let his head slump, and his eyes found something interesting on the ground to look at. He daren't mention to Cagline that he couldn't miss. If she found out what his bracelets did, then he might not get to keep them for much longer. "One day you might make a good huntress," Cagline said, "but you need to learn to follow orders." Gagara put a comforting arm around Reyes and told him, "I still love you." Reyes rested his head lightly on Gagara's shoulder and slipped his arm around her so that he could hold her. Then he watched with the others as Wallag worked. Reyes had been a member of the Hope for about 4 months now. Life in the Hope was a lot easier than he had expected. Most of the time he was free to do pretty much as he pleased. This was in some way a reflection of the attitude of their commanding officer, Dragonman Vernert, who seemed to want nothing to do with any of his charges. It sometimes seemed to Reyes that the officer wouldn't care if his charges were to take up arms and set about killing each other, or if they were to just walk out of the gates of the compound, never to return. Reyes had heard that things were different in some of the other regiments of the Hope around the city. Apparently some of them even got proper training, whereas in the 421st, they pretty much had to teach themselves how to fight. Chargeman Agnart wasn't just in charge of the fire pits. She was in charge of all the Harpies at this particular barracks. There were 33 Harpies in the Hope. Agnart had divided them into small groups of 5 or 6, and each group had a rota. One day they might be expected to hunt, on another they'd cook, and so on. Occasionally Agnar would swap a girl or two from one group to another, especially if she thought that a girl wasn't really getting on with the others in her group, but also so that all of her charges got to spend at least some time in the company of every other harpy in the regiment. This had been Race's first hunt with Cagleen as the hunt leader, and Wallag as the butcher. His previous hunt leader, a girl called Lofgren, had been only too happy to always let Race take the shot. The deer was cut up, and chunks were handed to each of the 5 members of the hunt. It hadn't taken long. Race was handed the haunches of the beast, which he held carefully in his arms, almost as if he was cradling a baby. One thing Race didn't like about hunting was the way he always seemed to be covered in blood by the end of the hunt. It looked as if today was going to be no exception. Before the day was through, he was going to have to find some water so he could wash the blood off. Hunt etiquette required the hunt leader to take to the air first, so Race duly waited for her to lead the way before he took to the air. The weight of the meat made it awkward for him to get off the ground, but it wasn't impossible, and before long they were flying back to the barracks in a weak V formation. They landed, in quick succession, by the fire pits, and immediately began to place the pieces of their kill in a pile on the ground in front of Agnart. 4 hunting parties were sent out every day. By the look of it, Cagleen's party had been the first to return so far this morning. The only meat currently being cooked on the spits were the leftovers from yesterday. Agnart got to work immediately. She waved to the nearest of the girls. Yesterday, the spit that girl was turning held no less than 5 chickens, but now it was down to a mere 2 that still had any meat on them. The girl in question, whose name Race didn't know, got up from her seat and lifted the top bar of the spit carefully off of its supports. The bar was metal and likely very hot, so the girl did her best to avoid touching it anywhere other than the handle. She slowly slid the skeletal remains of the chickens off of the spit, letting them drop onto a pile of decaying waste meat. Race looked at that pile distastefully. Once a week it was someone's job to dispose of that pile to stop it getting too big and encouraging too many insects to live in the compound. It could be surprising how big such a pile could get in a week, with only 33 harpies to feed. Having emptied the spit, the harpy came over and began to thread the pieces of the deer, one after the other, onto the bar. She seemed to take great pride in placing the deer on the spit in the right order, so that the creature still held some semblance to a deer. Then, with help from Agnart, she carried the deer-laden bar back to the spit and placed it carefully back on its supports. The harpy sat back on her chair and got to work turning the spit and cooking the new meat. "That's it," Cagleen declared. She brushed her hands together, cleaning some of the congealed blood from her fingers. "We will meet at the same time tomorrow for another hunt. Until then, your time is your own." Race scratched the end of his nose and then headed towards the spit that was cooking what was left of the cow that had been caught and killed yesterday. It had been brought in by one of the other hunting groups. Race felt fairly certain that there weren't any free-range cows in the area, suggesting to him that the huntresses in question had most likely raided one of the local farms. It wouldn't surprise him if most of the harpies in the city were raiding farms. There were so many harpies in the city at the moment, and so many hunting parties looking for meat for their respective villages, that it was getting harder and harder to find anything. As it was, today, they had had to fly a couple of miles to find the deer. If they had gone much further, they would have crossed the border into Floreth. Race had even heard some horror stories, suggesting it was becoming common practice for the hunting parties of certain villages to lie in wait for huntresses from other villages to return home, and then they would attack and steal the kill. Race peeled off a chunk of the cow using his claws to pry the meat free. He wasn't the only one to grab some meat before leaving. Flying burned a lot of energy, and that energy needed to be replaced. By the time Cagleen's hunting party had returned to the compound, every one of them was hungry. With food in their hands, the party began to leave the fire pits. Race didn't see where Cagleen went. She took to the sky and flew out of sight over one of the barrack buildings. Lagranoff stayed and chatted to Agnart for a few minutes, while Wallag was headed over towards the practice targets. Reyes and Gaggara walked together around to the front of the barracks houses and the drill ground. "Anything you want to do today?" Reyes asked. He glanced down at the bloodstains he had picked up from carrying the deer home. He really needed a wash. "I'd like to visit the arena," Gagara suggested. "I'd heard that Skeeg is up for her 20th bout this afternoon, and I'd like to see her win." Reyes shivered at the thought of going to the arena. He had been once before at Gagara's insistence. and had spent the whole time trying not to watch. It had been horrifying as a group of terrified prisoners were forced out into the sand of the arena. Most of the victims were newcomers. As recently as the day before, they had been upstanding members of the elven community, and in those cases had committed no more than some very minor crime that would have gotten them only a slap on the wrist in human society. The gladiators had been forced to kill each other for the amusement of the crowd. Gagara had loved it. Reyes had had to hide his eyes. Reyes remembered that Gagara's favourite, Skeeg the ogre, had also fought that day. In fact, it had been the main reason she had wanted to go in the first place. Skeeg's opponent had been a Harpy. She had also had 17 kills under her belt. The organisers liked to make the fights as fair as possible. A fair fight could prove far more entertaining than a one-sided slaughterhouse. Shearman the Harpy had stepped into the sand of the arena with large iron bands locking her wings into place, so that she couldn't just fly to freedom. Despite the fact that she was a Harpy, Gagara had still cheered for the ogre, as had most of the crowd. The ogre had been the first of the two to reach his 17th kill, and was therefore considered the favourite, even though Shearman had won just as many bouts as he. As Reyes remembered it, Shearman had put up a good fight. She had entered the arena armed with a short sword, not exactly the best weapon for a Harpy, and she had been disarmed by the first swing of Skeeg's club that had the added bonus of breaking her sword arm. But Shearman had proven more agile than the hulking Skeeg, and at one stage she had managed to climb onto the ogre's back, using the claws of her good hand to scratch his face while trying to tear out his throat. At the same time, her talons raked large gouges along his back. The ogre had retaliated by throwing himself backwards onto the ground, and the Harpy was flattened beneath his massive frame. Shearman had been stunned by the action, and lay on the arena sand helplessly, while Skeeg climbed slowly back to his feet, and then finished her off with a single blow of his club. Reyes had had to hide his eyes for that final blow. It seemed that the more bouts Skeeg won, the harder it was to find opponents with an equivalent number of kills for the ogre. It had been nearly 5 months since his last bout, and his upcoming 20th bout was being widely advertised about the city. Everywhere he went, Reyes saw posters announcing the upcoming fight. "Well?" Gagara asked. She moved her head in close to his and poked her tongue gently in his ear in an attempt to convince him. When she moved her head away again, she continued to stare at him with pleading eyes. Reyes looked into the depths of her cute eyes and felt himself melt. He loved her. How could he bring himself to say no to her? Perhaps the best tack would be to change the subject. "I need a wash," he said abruptly. "I'm covered in deer blood." "So are you." He stroked her gently with his hands, indicating where the blood had dried on her. "We both need a wash." "You and your desire for cleanliness," Gagara jibed. She prodded him with her blood-covered finger. "I like watching you wash," Reyes said. "Really?" Gagara commented with an amused smirk. I like to see you clean," Reyes clarified quickly. Gagara grinned. "Okay, handsome. Let's fly to the river." "The river?" Reyes said doubtfully. He felt he would much rather draw water from a well. The river scared him. "Yes," Gagara suggested. "It's an easy flight from there to the arena." Reyes shook his head to himself. He could swear that there were days when Gagara seemed to have a one-track mind. Sometimes he liked the track it was on because he would be thinking along those same lines himself. Today, though, he wanted to change the track. Wasn't there enough death in the city without trying to create more of it? Even now, out in the middle of the drill compound, a troll by the name of Krillin had been crucified on an X-shaped piece of wood, his arms tied to the upper struts with his legs tied to the lower, in such a way that they were held apart at an uncomfortable angle. Krillin had been put there about a week ago. It was the accepted punishment for stealing from another member of the Hope. The actual sentence for this crime was about 2 weeks, but since no food or water was given to the prisoner for the duration of the sentence, it was rare for someone to survive even 1 week this way. Krillin had died sometime during the night after his 4th day. Nevertheless, his body would remain on display as a warning to others for the full duration of his sentence. To be honest, Reyes didn't think the punishment had quite the sting on the remaining members of the Hope that was intended. Certainly there were a lot of soldiers milling about other parts of the drill ground, ignoring the fact that Krillin was even there. There was even some kind of sports event taking place between two uneven teams. Krillin seemed to be right in the middle of their playing field, and they were playing around him as if he was no more than a natural obstacle. Reyes watched them play for a minute. There were no Harpies playing the game. The other races tended to consider it unfair that whenever a Harpy got hold of the MacGuffin, they would take it into the air and out of reach of the non-flying races. They had instituted a rule that no one was allowed to fly, and this pretty much counted out the Harpies, who were next to useless on their feet. Reyes didn't really understand the game. The bit where they fought to get hold of the leg bone was clear enough, but then what? Neither side seemed to have any sort of receptacle for the other to put the bone in. Neither did the possessor of the leg bone actually do much with it, except throw it to another team member, who would then shout out a number. But that seemed to be the entire game. There just didn't seem to be any real score. It almost felt as if the whole thing was just an excuse for a punch-up. "That's awesome, isn't it?" Gagara commented as they watched. She seemed happy to be standing here on the sidelines watching the game for a minute. "I think so," Reyes replied. Orsa was a Minotaur. He was a resident of the same barracks house as Reyes and Gaggara, and indeed slept in the bed next to Reyes. Reyes felt that he and the Minotaur actually got on fairly well. Orsa was the one currently in possession of the leg bone, and he seemed to be just standing there in the middle of the playing ground, trying to fend off all comers. "I like Orsa," Gagara admitted. "As a friend, I mean," she added quickly. Her eyelids fluttered nervously. "She's a good friend," Reyes readily agreed. Orsa chucked the leg bone to another Minotaur on his team. The Minotaur, whom Reyes didn't recognise, grabbed hold of it and pulled it in tight to his chest. "Two!" he shouted. "Two what?" Reyes thought to himself as the Minotaur was promptly mobbed by 4 members of the other team. Gagara stood there patiently by his side for a moment, and then said, "We should get going. You still want that wash? And I'd like to be there in good time for the fight. He's up against an elf, you know. I want to see that elf's blood splattered across the arena sand." Reyes sighed inwardly. He glanced at Gagara. Part of him wanted to suggest that she should visit the arena alone. The thought, "I'll stay here and look after your mother," passed swiftly through his mind. Well, he did need a wash, and maybe if he could brave the river, he could build up the courage to tell her that he really didn't want to be a party to all that bloodshed. "Just think," Gagara said. "If Skeeg wins her bout today, she could be released into the care of a Hope Regiment. She might even end up in the bed next to yours." "Orsa's bed," Reyes commented dryly. "I'm sure Orsa wouldn't mind moving for a friend," Gagara crowed. Reyes nodded doubtfully. Should Skeeg ever be released into the care of any regiment, it was far more likely to be Rave's Raiders. Gagara nudged him. "Shall we go?" Reyes looked at her and nodded reluctantly. He then looked up at the sky with an eye to launching himself into it. The sky, immediately overhead, wasn't empty. One of the remaining hunting parties was returning from their hunt. There were 6 in this party, each of them carrying a chicken in her hands. It was the same hunting party that brought back chickens yesterday, and Reyes couldn't help but think that they had to have raided one of the nearby farms. Once the sky was clear again, Reyes took to the air. He hadn't even climbed as high as head height when Gagara reached out a hand and grabbed his tail. Reyes squawked loudly with surprise and virtually fell out of the air. He landed awkwardly on his feet and toppled over onto his knees, and then his hands. "What's up?" Reyes felt his voice sounded a little strained as he climbed carefully back to his feet. Gagara pointed over to the main compound gates. Something seemed to be happening there. The gates were wide open, allowing the ingress of somewhere between 30 and 40 red uniformed soldiers. The 2 guards that were supposed to be on duty at the gate had left their posts, probably at the command of the red-dressed soldiers, and they were now standing in the drill ground, watching the events unravel. Gagara had an unhappy edge to her voice as she said, "Inquisitors,